Pushkin.
Ambition is a force, and you can harness that force for good, or you can harness that force in a way that takes you away from yourself.
For so long, writer Jennifer Romolini prided herself on her work ethic. She climbed to the top of every corporate ladder and worked herself to the bone. But after years of burning herself out, she realized her ambition had turned toxic.
I really looked to the outside world like I had everything. But I was already at the top of that going, wait, is this it? Because I had not been building my personal and life resume at the same pace that I had been building my professional resume.
On today's show, Rethinking Ambition and what we can be ambitious for. I'm Maya Shankar, and this is A Slight Change of Plans, a show about who we are and who we become in the face of a big change. I first came across Jennifer's story when I read her memoir, Ambition Monster. The book covers a lot of ground. She dives deep into unresolved childhood trauma, romantic relationships that turn sour, and the costs of chronic overwork. I was most struck by the way Jennifer writes about ambition and how a big and unexpected change can make us rethink our relationship with it. Jennifer grew up in a working-class family just outside of Philadelphia, and in her family, ambition meant one thing: survival.
Both of my parents did not graduate high school, and they worked to survive. My dad was in the produce business. He started out working in a grocery store in the produce department. And he then was like, oh, there's a big markup here on lettuce. I think I could sell it for cheaper and still make a profit. So he started out selling cases of produce on a stand on the street. He built that business into a truck. He eventually turned that into a store, and he turned it into 4 stores around South Jersey and Philadelphia. It took effort and force to build that business and to get us out of what was, poverty. So I saw work as an act of force. I saw work as survival. I saw work as something that made you feel safe. This was all wrapped up in ambition for me. Ambition was wrapped up in survival. So the idea of work and compulsive work and never stopping work and having an incredible work ethic and never letting anyone down was just built into my bones.
Yeah. I read that you grew up loving Sassy magazine, and it's what made you want to become a writer. Is that right?
Yes. If you were a girl in the 80s and the 90s, Sassy was just this life raft. It was so different than like 17 or Teen magazine because it really was teaching you independence. And it was teaching you like a sense of autonomy that nothing else really was. It didn't want you to be there just for sort of the male gaze. It wasn't teaching you makeup tips per se, It was about music and culture and issues that girls were dealing with. And also it really put forward the personalities of its writers. And so I became obsessed with those writers. And, they all lived in New York, which was a place I kind of knew I wanted to live. I was like, oh, I'd like to be a magazine editor someday or writer.
I know that you started working in restaurants when you were 13 and you ended up working in restaurants for a decade. But you held on to this hope, right?
Yeah.
Like in the back of your mind that one day you might want to become that writer, the one that you had read about in Sassy magazine. So tell me how you started on the path towards that dream.
If there's no model in your life for the life that you want, it's so difficult to conceive of it because you cannot conceive of how you get from where you are to where you want to be. Mm-hmm. because I had no context for white collar work, creative work. I just had no context for it. Everyone I knew was a blue collar worker, that was just what we surrounded ourselves with. That was who my parents knew. And I didn't have, my childhood home was very chaotic. My parents they did the best they could with the tools that they had, but they were not very attentive. And my parents were teenagers when they had me. And like most teenagers, they were reckless and irresponsible in a lot of ways. And, I was witness to a lot of things I shouldn't have been witness to. There was violence in our home. There was some abuse. But more than anything, they just did not have the capacity to tend to my emotional needs. And I often felt like I was on my own. I was a really sensitive kid. I was a really creative kid. It was probably clear very early that I was going to take a different path than they did, that I was not going to be satisfied with the lives that they had, which is already a sort of alienating feeling when you feel different from what you grow up around.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. And I wonder whether in making that clear, either implicitly or explicitly, they felt rejected by you because you were saying the life you're living isn't going to be enough for me.
Of course.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, what I did was I tried to live the life I thought they wanted me to live. I married young. I married a man who was working class. I married a man who I didn't have a lot in common with, but I felt like I should marry. He was a nice man. He had a good job. But I felt so suffocated. I felt so like there was like a cloak over me. Because I wasn't living the life that I really wanted to live, and that I somewhere, like in the back of my mind, thought maybe I could live. Finally, I managed to get out of that marriage. And getting out of that marriage, if you come from any kind of traditional background, if you come from immigrant family, if you come from a Catholic family, religion, all sorts of things, getting a divorce young especially, it's like, well, what's wrong with you? What are you doing? So it took so much courage to make the move to get out of a marriage that was not right for me in my mid-20s. And at that point, I was like, okay, I'm all in. Because I already feel like such a failure. I'd already dropped out of college. I had already gotten a divorce. So by the time I'm 25, I'm a college dropout and a divorcee. I have no money to my name. I'm waiting tables. I feel like my life is over, which is ridiculous at 25, but that's the way I felt. I think the fact that I had sort of made what I thought were so many mistakes at that point, and I felt so messed up, I was like, well, I'm just going to go for it because I had nothing really to lose. I think I had like less than $100 in my bank account when I left my husband. So I did. I put myself through school. I waited tables full-time at night. I went to school full-time in the day. I had 2 internships at all times. I was trying to catch up. I was just racing and running. And I knew what I wanted. I wanted to get to New York and I wanted to work for a magazine.
You did dozens of interviews and were rejected from them all, right?
Yes.
And so eventually you ran out of cash. You had to move back home, live in your parents' attic. But then you got your first media job. Tell me the story about how that happened. So I didn't know how I was going to be perceived by this elite, extremely white. I'm white, but this is like an extreme, like elite white, environment. Publishing is built on connections and on pedigrees. And I didn't have either of those things. So at this point, I've been through, dozens of interviews, and I get this call about this job interview in New York for this business magazine. I take the train up, and the interviewer said, "What school is this?" And he pushes my resume over to me, and I was like, just because you haven't heard of it doesn't mean it's not a good school, and pushed the resume back to him.
And he had interviewed like 10 people before me. But because I had such an attitude problem, he just wanted that as his assistant. And that's how I got the job. It was like a miracle happened. I was so myself. I was so over it. But I also clearly, like, what I had been around. I knew how to deal with like customers in a restaurant. Like I had a lot more experience of being alive than most of the people going for an assistant job. I was 28 years old. He was, interviewing all these 22-year-olds. And to be somebody's assistant, you have to put out a lot of fires. I was actually perfect for that job, even without a pedigree.
So Jennifer, after that job, you started working for the publisher Condé Nast, right?
Yes.
You were an editor at a fashion magazine called Lucky. And at this point, you were hobnobbing with celebrities, you were interviewing actresses for photo shoots. But your dream of what you thought this job would be like did not actually match your day-to-day reality.
So because entry-level jobs pay so little in publishing across the board, and I think this is important to know, most people who work in these jobs come from some level of generational wealth, because you can't really afford to take these jobs and have a life in New York City unless you are subsidized in some way.
Mm-hmm.
I was subsidized by credit cards and taking on as many side jobs as I could, writing for the Kitchen and Bath magazine. I wrote for the Target in-house magazine. I was always working 3 or 4 jobs just to support my main job. So the level of wealth at Condé Nast was something that I had not prepared myself for. And I was really a bad fit because of that. And instead of looking at this environment and thinking, oh, this isn't for me, this doesn't work for me, instead I thought there was something wrong with me. And I had to contort and make myself acceptable to a place that I didn't respect.
What do you think prevented you from stepping away in that moment? Why didn't you leave?
At that point, I was so far into the tunnel of success. And those foundations of scarcity and survival, my father's work ethic and nonstop work, it was just so foundationally who I was. I had not unpacked any of it, right? Any of that. And I think that what happened was I was applying that sense of scarcity and survival onto work that really didn't matter. I was writing about shoes and belts and lip gloss, right? But I had that same survival intensity. It was really about, how do I get to the next level? How do I get a promotion? How do I make more money? I was in it. I was in it so hard. And to have walked away, it wouldn't have made sense for a resume. And I needed that resume to make sense because I was climbing a ladder and I was very strategic about climbing that ladder.
You kept climbing the ladder and you ended up achieving management roles, you were very successful. And eventually you got married, you had a child. From what I've read, it seems like it was during this period of your life where your workaholism took a turn for the worse.
Absolutely.
Can you paint me a picture of what an average day looked like for you? So you're a mother, you're a spouse, and you're also working, what you say is 60 hours a week. Is that right?
Yeah, 60, more, as much as I could work, I was working. So an average day looked like wake up at 5 a.m., breastfeed, shower, change, check my email, answer emails, breastfeed again, take the child to daycare, head into work, pump breast milk, take the train home, pick the child up from daycare, breastfeed, work, bath time, breastfeed, work, take out, sleep. It was nonstop. And I probably should have. And again, this is all gets into class things, right? I resisted help. I didn't want to bring a nanny into my house. I didn't know anybody who had nannies. That felt so wrong to me, but I needed support so badly. And I was making enough money that I could have had support, but I just didn't understand what that kind of support looked like.
Yeah, I actually think this is an important moment to clarify. Some people actually just do have to work that much or even more to make ends meet. And something you clarify about your story is that you were working beyond what you would have needed to work to be financially secure.
Yes. So what we're talking about here is an exceptionally privileged position to be in. And we're talking about going beyond basic survival because, yes, I could have had to have worked like I had throughout all of my 20s, 2 jobs. I was no longer in that position. I was making 6 figures, which was beyond my conception of money. I just couldn't even, I was like, I probably could have afforded to get help, but I didn't really understand that. I didn't understand that that's how systems that's how people work. They have support. I didn't understand that. My mom never had help,
Yep.
So this ignorance was really a problem.
Eventually your body issued a wake-up call for you. You developed chronic laryngitis from overusing your voice, right? Giving all these presentations and talks as an executive. The doctor told you that you needed to go on vocal rest. You had to get vocal cord surgery. And it sounds like this was a rare moment where the universe kind of intervened and was like, Jennifer, you got to slow down.
What happened with my voice, and let me just say here, I had so many physical issues around work. I had a gastric ulcer. I had massive stress. I had panic attacks. I had headaches. I had so many physical symptoms brought on by overwork. But the one that shut me down was the one that had to shut me down. Like I couldn't speak. My vocal cords were bleeding. I was going to have to get surgery. And I understood that I might not ever be able to speak again if I spoke during this 2-week vocal rest. So I took it seriously. And I would sit in meetings and just listen and watch. And at this point, I was in the C-suite. And I found it to be an unkind, unproductive, callous environment. Because I do think that over time in corporate environments and as an executive, you make concessions. You do things that in your regular life you wouldn't do. You toe the company line. You fire people in ways that you are not comfortable with, but this has to be done. You cut budgets when you know you shouldn't cut budgets. You do things that go against your values. And when I really was observing it, I thought, this is no longer scratching whatever itch I originally had. I don't belong here anymore. This isn't for me. And even having that thought was terrifying, because what happens if I don't want to do this anymore? My entire identity was wrapped up in what I did for a living. I mean, beyond motherhood, but I had room for nothing else. I didn't have any real friendships in my life. I had an entirely unbalanced life, and most of my energy went into my career. And at this point, my career was public. Like I had magazines at this point, like doing interviews with me, asking how to get my life. I had, to the outside world, an absolute dream job. I had this precocious child that, people saw pictures of on Instagram. I lived in a nice home in Los Angeles. I really looked to the outside world like I had everything. But I was already at the top of that going, wait, is this it? My life did not feel like my own. And the worst part of it was I had zero connection to myself because I had not been building my personal and life resume at the same pace that I had been building my professional resume. So my life was completely unbalanced, and it was very scary.
We'll be back in a moment with a slight change of plans. After years of climbing the corporate ladder, Jennifer Romolini had finally made it to the C-suite. She was an executive at a celebrity-owned website for women. But less than a year into the new job, she developed an issue with her vocal cords. A doctor told her she needed surgery and a 2-week vocal rest. And it was during this period that Jennifer began to see her workplace as, quote, a great dance of winner-take-all dysfunction.
And so following that surgery, I did the job. I showed up to everything. I put in good work, but I stopped going above and beyond. I stopped meeting unrealistic demands. If I got an all caps Slack tirade at 4 a.m, I didn't answer it as soon as I woke up. I let go of work a little bit. I took like my white knuckles off the steering wheel. I still was working, and I had not let any balls drop, but I wasn't available for anybody's whim at any time. So about 6 months after this, after not answering every just ridiculous call, after 6 months of not treating everything with like a level of like life and death urgency, it turned out that the person they had hired, who had done all of that, versus the person I was now, I was no longer a good fit.
You got a knock on your office door. Tell me about that day.
So it's Monday afternoon. It's about 4:00. So I have 2 people come into my office and they tell me that they're going in another direction. They don't say fired. And I say, so you're firing me because I want to disrupt the script. Like I was such an asshole throughout this whole process, but I was in shock.
Of course, yeah.
I couldn't fathom that I would be fired after how hard I'd worked.
Yeah.
And I felt so ashamed that I had not held it together. I felt like I had really let my family down. There was so much to process after getting fired. It was a real sense of grief. And I know people go through grief much heavier than this, but I really grieved so much after getting fired. I grieved the life that I had given away to various toxic jobs. I grieved the time I would never get back. I grieved the person that I wished I had been in different situations, the concessions I had made. And I found after I got fired, I had always been able to like talk myself up, just get over it, pull this shit together. But I was just fried. I no longer had like the password to my brain. I was just kind of broken by this experience and I needed to process it. I was in absolutely no shape to go back to work.
In the aftermath of your being fired, how did you put the pieces back together?
I didn't take any jobs that were going to have any kind of high profile. And I was offered a lot. They just kept coming and I had to reject them. And I had to say, we're going to make a lot less money in this house. And I reconnected with my life. I started I took a woodworking class. I just started doing things out of curiosity. I flexed creative muscles that I forgot that I had. And then eventually I said, okay, I think it's time to get a job that has health insurance. I think we need some more stability here. This is not feeling sustainable and stable. And I made a very intentional choice about the kind of job I would go back to. I was so thoughtful about the peace that I had gained and protecting it. So I started thinking about what I like about work, because I love work. Like, I love it. It brings me so much pleasure. I love mastery. I love learning new things. So I started to think, well, what did I love in work? How do I work so it serves me, not some external idea of me?
But how do you actually practice that? It's not like there's a switch in your brain you can just flip that's like, I don't care anymore about how I'm perceived externally or where I am on the ladder. So what advice would you give to people who want to train their brains to get to the place that you're at? What does that look like?
I'll tell you exactly how this all changed for me. I sort of pursued this, what I thought was going to be a freelance job. And it was a cannabis website. It was a website that was about weed. It was run by these like 25-year-old Irish kids. This job was the dumbest job I've ever had. Okay. It didn't even pay that well, but it paid enough to pay my half of the monthly bills. Everybody in my life said, this is a joke job. You're going to go be the editor of a weed site. What are you, 23? This is the death of your career. Like, people who I trust and advise, they're like,
Sure.
what are you doing? How are you going to explain this? And I was like, I don't know. It seems like fun. So I took this stupid weed job and I worked it for a year. And it was the best thing I ever did. And so after that ended, I was like, well, what do I like? What do I want to do?
What did you want?
I wanted stable, contained work. And while I had enjoyed being a manager, solving other people's problems I felt like I had done my time for that. So I very intentionally climbed back down the ladder. I was at the top. I was in the C-suite. And I started applying for jobs that were mid-level jobs with mid-level salaries. But, I could handle a mid-level salary. I'd handled much less. It took a lot of convincing because I would be in interviews and interviewers, the recruiter would say, you're overqualified for this. And I'd say, yes, I know I'm overqualified, but this is the kind of job I want. It took a very long time. It took like 6 months to finally convince somebody that I just wanted to be in the middle again. But I have a job now that I just write about beauty products all day. And I love it. And I'm excellent at it. And I'm respected. And I have a lot of autonomy. And I have a lot of free time after I finish my job to pursue creative projects if I choose, to spend time with family and friends. The job does not fill up my whole brain because I'm not thinking of high-level strategy all day. I don't have executives coming at me from every direction. The job is very focused, which allows me to do it very well in the hours I do it each day, and then to leave it behind. And that was what I wanted.
You write about how ambition can be so toxic, but at the same time, you're not repudiating ambition. You say you love ambition. And so it really just becomes a question of how we channel our ambition.
Yes.
And I'm curious to hear from you how, especially as women, I don't want us to do away with our ambition because there's already factors working against that, right? So how do we channel our ambition in ways that are maybe healthier or make us happier or are more sustainable?
You pair ambition with self-awareness. You stay aware of what is happening. You don't use work to stuff things down, to bury your feelings in. You don't hide in ambition. You use ambition to bring your life into color, into fullness. Ambition is a force, and you can harness that force for good, or you can harness that force in a way that takes you away from yourself and the things that you actually care about. We think success has to be big when it's so often like the most satisfying success is quiet and small.
Tell me what small and quiet looks like for you in your day-to-day life.
I've designed my life in such a way that nothing is neglected. My relationships aren't neglected. I'm not neglected. Work is not neglected. Everything is in balance. And I'll tell you, my cat died over the weekend. And I had to make a decision last week. She got very sick last week. And she was my cat for 16 and a half years. And I was very close to this animal. She was a companion. And because of the way I've designed my life, I was able to be present and non-stressed to make decisions about the end of this animal's life, to take a full day to grieve, to tell my boss I might not be working at 100% the next couple of days. I'm in some pain. And because I've done that, I'm going through the challenges of life. I'm riding them like a wave, much more naturally, because I'm not gripping, because nothing requires that kind of hold on me. And I think that was a success, because I got to see this cat off in this very peaceful and quiet way. And I had the luxury of work not intruding in that space. And that's what I want for everyone, is to have a spaciousness. I think that is success. And when work is all consuming and doesn't have boundaries, and when you are chasing something inside of work that you're honestly never going to find, you lose all of this other beauty, which is what a successful life really is.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. Coming up on A Slight Change of Plans, I speak to David Yeager, a professor of psychology and an expert on adolescent development. If you've ever wondered how to better support the young people in your life, or if you're a young person wondering why on earth older people just can't seem to understand you, this is the episode for you. David busts cultural myths about the young adult brain and shares some amazing science about what's really going on.
You can think of the adolescent brain as like the social R&D engine of our culture. Something that looks like risky and idiotic to us is maybe their way of creatively trying to solve the problem of having more of the thing that brings you social success and fewer of the things that bring you social failure.
That's up next on A Slight Change of Plans. A Slight Change of Plans is created, written, and executive produced by me, Maya Shankar. The Slight Change family includes our showrunner, Tyler Green, our senior producer, Kate Parkinson Morgan, our producer, Brianna Garrett, and our engineer, Erica Huang. Luis Guerra wrote our delightful theme song, and Ginger Smith helped arrange the vocals. A Slight Change of Plans is a production of Pushkin Industries, so a big thanks to everyone there. And of course, a very special thanks to Jimmy Lee. You can follow A Slight Change of Plans on Instagram at Dr. Maya Shankar. See you next week.